Hello, everyone. My name is Jeremy Ellis, and I am excited about today's interview conversation. For those who are new to the channel, I am a direct descendant of Kupoli and Rose Allen, two of the enslaved Africans aboard Clotilda. And today, I am excited to welcome and to have a conversation with Dr. Hannah Durkin, who is a historian specializing in the transatlantic slave and African diaspora art and culture. Dr. Durkin holds a PhD in American Studies from the University of Nottingham and a postgraduate diploma in journalism from Leeds Trinity University. She is an advisor to the History Museum of Mobile, which worked on the memorialization of Clotilda survivors, and was a keynote speaker at the Africatown 2021 Spirit of Our Ancestors Festival. And she is also, and we are excited to have her on today's show, she is also the author of The Survivors of the Clotilda, The Lost Stories of the Last Captives of the American Slave Trade. And so, Dr. Durkin, I want to welcome you to the show. But before you say anything, I want the audience to know that I had an opportunity to read Dr. Durkin's book. And after reading Dr. Durkin's book, I sent her an email, and that email essentially said, I thought your book was the most complete and compelling truth told about my ancestors. I learned about my ancestors' shipmates, their individual lives, their names, and where they lived, what they endured, and how resilient they were. You did a masterful job with this book, and this is probably in regards to the story of the 110. This is probably the most important book written about my ancestors, and I want to say thank you. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Durkin to the show. How you doing, Dr. Durkin?
I'm good. Thank you so much for that really kind introduction, and thank you for having me here. It's really an honor and a privilege.
Absolutely. So I have a number of questions about who you are, specifically about the book, but I wanted to ask you how you were doing. You spent a few weeks. Since the day we're recording this, I would say it's been about 2 weeks, maybe 2.5 weeks since you visited Alabama, and you were able to travel to Mobile, as well Africatown, and to the Black Belt Selma. So how are you doing since your travels to the Americas?
I'm really good. I think I'm still on a high from that wonderful experience. It was so great. It was so great to meet everyone, to see all the great work that's being done, obviously to travel to Selma as well, and just it was just absolutely fantastic. And yeah, I hope I can make it back again soon, that's for sure.
Is there a moment from that trip that stands out to you?
Oh, there are so many. I mean, we obviously went to Selma and had a tour of the city. I also saw the play a couple of times. That was, that's Terence Spivey's play, which is fantastic. And we also caught a bit of the Mardi Gras, so I did that as well. And just meeting everyone, just hearing from people, especially when most of the communication has been via email, so it's so much better to actually, get to know people properly and spend time with them. So it was really fantastic.
That's awesome. Had you visited Alabama prior to the February 2024 trip?
No, I think the closest I've been to Florida and I've been to Georgia before, but I've never been to Alabama, so it was my first trip.
Good deal. Okay. Well, I'm happy that you were able to make it back. So were there any traveling experiences? How was your travel? Did you have any layovers? How was that experience?
Yeah, it was good. I mean, I think I had a bit of a layover in Atlanta, but it was good. Getting home, dealing with jet lag is always not great. But apart from that, it was just a really smooth experience, and yeah, really great. So it was wonderful.
Good deal. So we had the opportunity to spend a few few days with Dr. Durkin, and we actually had an opportunity, you and I, to share the stage at the bookstore to discuss your book. And so I wanted to start off by asking, who is Dr. Hannah Durkin, and how did you even get involved in the transatlantic slave trade?
Yeah, so I mean, I probably should. I don't know how far back I should go, really. So I mean, I've been doing this for quite a long time now. As you mentioned, I have a PhD, so I've been a researcher for a long time. And I think maybe it stemmed a bit from. I mean, you know, my ancestry is very, very English and Irish, right? So you know, my dad's ancestors, I think we're all Irish-speaking Irish folk, so can't get more Irish than that. But maybe a couple of decades ago, my mother was looking into her family tree, and she found some Jamaican ancestry, and it was probably also Nigerian ancestry. But so I have very distant, very, very distant, but sort of had direct links to the transatlantic slave trade. And yeah, so both of my maternal grandparents probably had West African ancestry, but also, I mean, I know I've got at least one ancestor who was an enslaver as well. So I was just aware, because in the UK we don't tend to talk about the transatlantic slave trade that much because it's seen as sort of over there in the Americas. But of course we were leading players in the transatlantic slave trade. So when I was going on to do, you know, researching, I think I was drawn to look at, you know, the Black Atlantic. And most of my research was really kind of 20th century research. I hadn't really planned to research. I mean, my PhD supervisor did work a lot on slavery, though. So I think the projects that she got me involved in meant I was writing about, you know, slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, or even cultural representations of it and artistic representations of it as well. But I was actually working on a project on the writer Zora Neale Hurston. And this is how I get involved in the Clotilda research. So I was working on her films because she was quite possibly the first professional African-American woman filmmaker. So I was interested in sort of creating an alternative history of cinema, right, by looking at her as one of my case studies. And she was a graphic filmmaker, so she filmed people in the South and documented their folk stories as well. But she was filming people just working and, you know, enjoying leisure time in the South. And I wanted to try and tell their stories a bit and identify them. And of course, one of the people she filmed and interviewed was, of course, Kazula or Cudjoe Lewis, who was long thought to be the last, well, not only the last Clotilda survivor, but the last known Middle Passage survivor. But Hurston mentioned in a letter to Langston Hughes, her fellow writer, of course, and friend until they fell out, that she met another Clotilda survivor. And scholars had always assumed this woman couldn't be identified, that she was lost to history. But I noticed when I was trying to find the names of the people in these films, I was looking at this posthumously published book of Hurston's. It wasn't published until about 2001. So really quite recently, because Hurston died about 40 years before that. And so I basically looking through this appendix to this book that lists the interviewees and noticed that one of them was a woman named Sally Smith, a so-called Tarkar, I think it's written as Gold Coast, it's put down as Africa. So I realized actually that's the name of the woman. And so I just did a lot of digging to try and tell her story, because I realized her story had sort of been lost, and I probably could work at least who she was. And so I just kept searching for her. And then when I wrote about her, I realized I'd missed another Clotilda survivor, Matilda McCreer. So I tried to then write her story as well, and it spiraled into a book.
I noticed, and I mentioned this when we last spoke, but I was very, and I do see copies of the book over your shoulder. I highly recommend to those who have, if you get an opportunity, to go purchase the book. But one thing I noticed immediately, because when I received the book, I was able to get an advance copy. Thank you so much, Dr. Durkin. But I looked at the number of pages, and I was like, okay, I have a lot of reading to do in a few days, few weeks. But then I realized that you had just as much notes and bibliography as you actually had of the actual story, the chapters that you told. So out of curiosity, the question is, how much research did you have to do for this book? And how long did it take you actually to write it? And this is my copy for those who are watching.
Yeah, so I mean, kind of lived it really. I kind of spent a lot of time researching, and I think probably lockdown, because as I say, I hadn't been to Alabama before, right? So a lot of the material I relied on was recently digitized newspaper articles, fairly recently digitized genealogical records. It was very painstaking, right? So a lot of the time it was, okay, here's someone on a census listed as African born, or their parent is listed as African born, and then you put them, it's in a kind of list, put them into a list of potential Clotilda survivors, really, and then try to match them up on another census, looking for people who, trying to look for clusters of communities, basically. There was a lot of, and then just doing keyword searches on newspapers.com, because so many newspapers have been digitized. So the article I started writing on Radoshi, Sally Smith, the woman that Zora Neale Hurston identified, I identified her in the spring of 2016. Well, I came across her name in the spring of 2016. So that's 8 years ago almost. And then I think I realized I had a book so I published my research on Radoshi in the spring. It took me ages to write this article. So in about the spring of 2019, I think. And so just before the Clotilda was officially identified in the Mobile River, so it was like 6 weeks before or something like that. And then people immediately were asking me, where's the book? And I hadn't thought about it as a book. And then obviously, when I realized I had Miss Matilda McCrea's story, then I realized I had a second article. And then I guess I kept looking, because I thought maybe this probably is a book. I thought it would be, so it's obviously it's a scholarly book in lots of ways. It's got lots of footnotes and a bibliography, but I tried to write it more for a general audience. I thought originally it was going to be like an academic monograph that's where at the analysis and having a clear structure in terms of introduction and conclusion, etc. But I think it just, I was persuaded to try and make it a bit more accessible, and hopefully it is more accessible than.
No, it really is. And I was amazed at the number of survivors you were able to identify. My question is, out of those 84 or so listed survivors, one thing you did, let me say this first. One thing you did that was really helpful and very beneficial was in the front of the book, you identify the names of the survivors. Thank you for listing out those that may have drowned at sea or upon arrival may have died while aboard Clotilda. I think it was powerful for you to acknowledge and include them. But you also list out the Clotilda Africans on the front and list out all of their names. I think it's about 84 that I counted or so that you list out and identified. Out of these 84 names, and we may touch on this later, but was there one individual story, one individual truth that really resonated with you as you were writing the book?
So, of course, there were very, very many. I think one person's story who, or truth, if you like, really stood out was because.
Say that name again, because your
yes.
mic. Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I just threw my mic around. So Buja Moore, her story, I think, really stood out because she was a grown woman when she was kidnapped and sold and forced aboard the Clotilda. But she had 3 very young children, including a baby, and those children were left behind. So she never saw them again. And she lived for another 70 years. So she dies outside Montgomery in July 1930, so almost 70 years to the day after the Clotilda lands in Mobile Bay. And I think what was so striking about her stories was that in one sense she was so visible in Montgomery because she traveled to Montgomery twice a week and doing as she would do from home. So like she would do from home. So she was she would have been a tradeswoman back home. That would have been her occupation, and that's what she does in Montgomery as well. So she takes this segregated train twice a week into Montgomery and sells her wares that she has foraged from her home. And she's so well known in that community or in Montgomery, that she can rely on the, if you can't afford to buy a train fare, then the staff at the train station will help her out to help her to go home. And of course, the journalist interviews her in 1923 because she's still going to Montgomery until 1925. And the journalist interviews her in 1923 and says that, everybody just about knows her. So she's so important. That was what was so striking. It was also just her determination to continue to live the life that she would have done back home. She has 2 more children in Montgomery. A daughter called Amanda, and I think the other daughter was called Mary. Yeah, in fact, I'm sure Mary.
Fascinating, because one thing the book does is shows the overlap and the start of what we now call the civil rights movement, between and that overlap between when a number of the survivors would start to die, and some of the activists at that time who knew the survivors and who actually in some instances represented them and supported them on reparations. You talk about, and I think it may have even been the last chapter, you talk about one of the survivors going to the courthouse essentially asking for reparations. Can you talk a little bit about that story and the activists who supported the survivor and that overlap with the survivors and the civil rights movement?
Absolutely. And maybe first I'll just go back to Boojah Moore, actually, because she's traveling to Montgomery twice a week. And also she lives close to a man named E.D. Nixon, who basically led the Montgomery bus boycott before Martin Luther King took over from that. He worked at the train station, so he probably knew her because of that as well. So he's probably interacting with her a lot in the 1920s because he's a young man at this point. And over in Selma, so Radoshi, the woman I first identified, she was friends with Amelia Boynton Robinson.
Sally Smith. I think it's important
Yes.
that's one thing that people need to connect the dots with. So for those who are watching the podcast, Dr. Hannah Durkin talked about Sally Smith and Zora Neale Hurston and that connection. And Sally Smith is Rhodesia.
Yeah, and so Amelia Boynton Robinson actually refers in her memoir to her regular meetings with Radoshi, and she talks about her meetings with her as being among her richest experiences in the 1930s. So those are her words, and she talks about just how energized and inspired she is by the community in which Radoshi lives, which is Boga Chissa, which is outside Selma. And just to give some context to Amelia Boynton Robinson, so she's part of this 30-year campaign for voting rights in Dallas County. And she's the person who invites Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to Selma, which basically sparks the Selma to Montgomery marches, which in turn leads to the passing of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So she's a key figure in the civil rights movement, and she's clearly inspired by a Clotilda survivor. She's hearing her stories, she's learning about the horror that she endured, but she's also learning about how Radoshi endures and survives. And to move over slightly to the story of Matilda McCreer, because you mentioned this courthouse visit. So Matilda McCreer was the woman I wrote about after when I wrote about Radoshi, I realized I missed Matilda McCreer's story. So Matilda McCreer was just 2 years old when she was kidnapped,
Yes.
Clotilda. She had 2 brothers and 3 sisters and a mother named Gracie. And the 2 brothers were left behind on the West African coast, never to be seen again. And when the mother and the 4 daughters, including Matilda, arrive in Mobile or arrive in Alabama, they're separated. So the mother Gracie and her 10-year-old sister, the mother Gracie, Matilda, and her 10-year-old sister Sally are kept together, but the two other sisters are sold away, again, never seen again. And so Matilda's just 2 years old, but she, yes, but at the end of her life, Rodoshi and Matilda McCrea go to Mobile. They somehow travel from outside Selma to Mobile to visit Kazula, Cudjoe Lewis. And they, they basically, they see the site of the Clotilda's landing for the first time. They see the, the space that, they see the horrors of that experience for the first time. And of course they learn from Kazula, his memories. So they share this horrible memory, this horrible trauma that's defined their lives. And it inspires Matilda McCrea when she gets back to her home. She's about 15 miles outside Selma, to travel from that home to Selma, to Dallas County Courthouse, to basically demand reparations, to demand, compensation for her kidnapping and enslavement. And of course, she goes there and the judge sends her away. But this story is written about because a journalist sees her, basically, she attracts attention. And what's also striking is that this courthouse is, of course, a key site in the Selma voting rights campaign as well. This is where, voting rights campaigners go to demand the right to vote, basically, to register to vote. And so this is a key moment, a key space in the civil rights movement. And what's striking as well is that the man who's in charge of the chairman of the Board of Registrars at Dallas County Courthouse at this time is a man named Victor Bethune-Atkins. And Victor Bethune-Atkins was Matilda McCrea's landlord and employer for about 20 years. And before him, it was his father, and before him, it was his father-in-law. So there were these huge, massive connections between the Clotilda survivors and the civil rights movement.
Absolutely. And that's one thing I appreciated about the book was not only, and I'm going to go back to the beginning here in a second, but I appreciated just seeing the connection and the overlap and the way you wrote it as a story or as a novel. So it was easy to digest, but it also just showed the connection of these young up and coming activists who would play an important role in the civil rights movement, and these older survivors who were essentially the last translated slave trip to the Americas, and they were in their older age and what they had experienced. So showing that interaction was magnificent, as well as how you got into the psychological aspects of what they would have experienced, such as Bruja and kind of her leaving behind three children and how that could have mentally played a mental role over her life. Let's start from the beginning. Who are the survivors in their native homeland? I think it's important that we humanize these individuals. I was actually taken aback from one of the questions that we were asked at the book signing, where it's important that when we discuss the survivors, we discuss how skillful they were, how educated they were, how they spoke in their native language. These were not illiterate individuals. These were not unskillful folk. These were folks who were masterful of their craft prior to their arrival to the Americas. So can you just give us a sense of who they were in their native land prior to their arrival to the Americas?
Absolutely. So first I should probably say that the overwhelming historical evidence suggests that they were from present-day southwest Nigeria, which matches the map that Kazula drew, actually, and where he's pointing out the ports that they passed horribly from the march to the coast. And he does talk about actually being from, so not too far away from Ogbomosho, which is in basically present-day Oyo State, Nigeria. So this is a community of, most of them appear to have been Yoruba or Yoruba. This is their specific ethnic group. other people, and they all appear to have been, apart with one exception, to have been living in the same town. Not all of them were. There were people from different ethnic groups visiting. It's not clear how many, if any, of those were on the Clotilda, but the vast majority appear to have been Yoruba, and also in some cases we see with Matilda and her family units as well. But what's important to note about this space in the mid 19th century, this is what's really sad, really horrible about reading the experiences of the Clotilda survivors, is how much they describe their homeland as an Edenic, a paradise, an Eden, a paradise, right? So they describe it as, and it's this really fertile space. It's a space where fruit grow wild. They plant crops like beans, they plant and they cultivate palm oil. But this is a land.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yams are the major crop, exactly. And they're incredibly hardworking. They have to. They're farmers basically, but also they're artisans. So these are people who are carpenters. They work with leather. They work all these different kinds of trades and skills. And also, what's really striking is that these are massive urban societies, right? So this is just a town, but within space in the mid 19th century, these are cities with tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people in them. This is a very urban space. And so these aren't just, in most cases, just little villages or these are complex, societies. And of course, children learn how to hunt, but they also learn trades from their family trade. These are really skilled and, as you say, highly functioning, highly sophisticated societies. And obviously my book just gives a snippet of that, really, because there isn't a lot of space to talk about that. But I do just try to spotlight that, because it's what they tell, it's what they tell, or what they told their interviewers.
And you also, and I don't want to skip over this too quickly, but another thing that you do is you describe through their interviews about how they essentially would go to the market and sell these yams and their skills and in their native land. This is what they were doing. And decades later, they would do the same thing once they learned of their freedom in the Americas, because you just, like, for example, talked about Boudra getting on the train and coming to Montgomery to sell what she had grown and what she had crafted. So they were able to to me, the intellect of still remembering, using their skill set to make a living in the States is incredible to me.
Absolutely. And they're doing that in Mobile as well. The people like Zuma or Shamba are doing that. And Charlie Lewis's daughter are doing it as well. They're carrying wares on their heads and carrying his produce, because he's an incredibly successful farmer and businessman. They're carrying his produce to town. So these traditions are passing down actually to children as well, which is
absolutely. It was interesting. I want to talk about the Barracoon and what that experience would have been like for them. We don't talk about the Barracoon a lot. What resonated with me as to why Captain Foster, when he arrived, why he would select those group of survivors. And a lot of that, to me, just using my reasonable kind of deduction senses, is that they were probably those survivors who were fairly new to the Barracoon. They were probably more at strength and probably looked more nourished than some of the other captives in the Barracoon. Can you talk, and maybe this is my hypothesis, but can you kind of talk about what they would have experienced once they arrived to one of those barracoons?
Yeah. Now, horribly, I mean, so barracoons. So during the illegal trade, during the illegal slave trade, because of course it's the US bans it in 1808. The UK does it around the same time, and what that means is that there's no illegal slave trade going on, and what that means is people are kind of hidden on the coast. So they're kept in these barracoons, which are basically little prisons or quote unquote pens, for longer periods of time, so they can then be pushed to the ship while the anti-slavery patrols are out of sight. So they're often kept in longer, grouped in longer, and the ship, slave ship might come along far less frequently. So they're waiting for slave ships to arrive so they can then sell them. So the horrible thing is that the Clotilda survivors appear to have been trapped in this barracoon for 3 weeks. And that's 3 weeks. That's a horrible length of time. I mean, it's not the same length as the Middle Passage itself, but it's half the length of it. And what's horrible about this really confined,
but 3
sanitary,
weeks, but 3 weeks compared to what some of the other captives may have been experienced is actually considerably short period of time. What you think? Or I mean, not really for an individual being barracoon, but I was just saying that could have been one of the reasons why Captain Foster selected those 125 is they may have been more nourished or appeared to be more nourished and more at strength than some of the other captives who may have been living in the barracoon. But this is our hypothesis. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's I think a really important observation. I think one thing that's striking about in the book Barracoon, because it suggests that he talks about each nation being in a barracoon by itself. So what he's saying that is each ethnic group is kept together. So what he's saying is that only him and his fellow townsfolk are together in that barracoon. So others are in different barracoons. So when Captain Foster goes into, presumably that's the only barracoon he goes into. So he's only selecting from the people from the town who would have arrived at the same time. But it's striking the various things he is selecting. So half of them are girls and boys or men and women, right? So 50% male, 50% female. They're forced into circles by, arranged by sex. So you have a group of women and girls, a group of men and boys. And I guess that might explain why Matilda's mother Gracie was, she was with her mother, why her brothers were left. If they were in a different group, they weren't as part of that family unit together in that circle. But it's just very. I mean, he's choosing very young people in most cases. That's a big selection for him because a lot of the Clotilda survivors. I mean, a lot of my sort of estimations of their ages. A lot of it is drawing from. So, for example, the 1870 census. That person listed as in their 20s on the 1870 census. Then they were probably in their teens, 1860 most probably. But it's some of it is guesswork. But other contemporaneous documents suggest that we've got this Quilla, Ossa, and Lucy who were enslaved near to where Matilda is enslaved, and they're listed as teenagers still in this estate file of their former enslavers. So it's clear that a lot of them were very, very young, and that appears to have been a big decision, I think, directing his, directing his choices, certainly their age, but also their general health.
Yeah, but it was, those things were not sanitary by no means. It was, the barracoons is where they ate and where a lot of sicknesses took place in those barracoons, and they didn't get a lot of sunlight. It was
exercise.
And just the smell itself. It was not anything. Those barracoons were not anything pleasant for any human being. He selected as many men, and for every man he tried to select the women. They range from age of 2. You mentioned this earlier with Matilda McCrary being 2 and Otis being in their early 20s. One thing that stood out to me was, and based on what you just said, was, he selected a 2-year-old. Imagine what that experience was like, not only for the mother, but for that 2-year-old. Why would he have selected a 2-year-old?
So I mean, it is so striking. I mean, he's clearly selecting a family unit, right? So he seems to be picking all 4 girls in this family, right? So
Hmm.
presumably they're aged from 2 to maybe the early teens, you know. So, but I know 2 years old. I mean, this expectation that she's going to be enslaved and making money for the person who enslaved her for decades, right? There's an expectation that she is such a long-term investment, which is a really horrible way to look at a 2-year-old child. Yeah, it's just it defies, you know, it's just beyond imagining and processing. I think when you think about what a 2-year-old child is like, and enduring the Middle Passage with her mother, it's unimaginable.
Yes. Let's talk about the Middle Passage and what they experienced on Clotilda. For those that know the truth about this, Captain Foster purchased 125. He would leave with the 110, trying to escape uh, from being chased by some British warships. Uh, for 13 days, they would essentially be isolated in the cargo hold of Clotilda before they were brought to, before they even saw the sunlight. This would be the first time that many of them would have even seen the ocean. I think Cujo Lewis talks about that. So imagine the seasickness that they could have experienced. Not eating, being stripped of their clothes was really dehumanizing for them. Um, Eating, sleeping, vomiting, women on their menstrual cycles, the horror of Boudra and Gracie, who left children behind as mothers, the horror of Yawith, who's a father who left behind, who was separated from his children at Ocean. All of these things are what they are experiencing. A 2-year-old clinging to her mother, not knowing what they're going to experience, just the trauma of the sounds of mourning and groaning and the deaths at sea. Can you just elaborate even more on kind of even what I just shared, what that experience would have been like for each of the 110?
Yeah, so I think, as you know, I mean, one thing that's really hard to process is that this was about 45 days as well. So this is a month and a half, 6.5 weeks. This is an incredibly long period of time. And I think one thing that archaeologists have been able to show, because Emma Langdon Roach, who wrote an important history of the Clotilda survivors in 1914, she talked about there being enough space in the hold for them to stand up. But recent archaeological evidence suggests that they were forced to lie on these planks that would only have given them, to basically been less like 6 feet long. So they're probably chained as well. Instead of the men and the boys are very likely chained. It's not clear 100% of the girls were and the women, but whether they were chained or not, it's just horrible. I mean, it's just unimaginable. And also again, I tried to give this a lot of careful attention, but Clotilda survivors talked about people being thrown overboard, people who died. So Radoshi remembered a little girl being thrown overboard, and then a man from her town being thrown overboard. Matilda McCrea learned from her mother Gracie that 2 boys were thrown overboard, and that one of those 2 boys was Matilda's cousin. So that's 4 people who appear to have been different people. And there's actually 2 anonymous handwritten notes in the Mobile Public Library that allude to the death of a 16-year-old girl just 2 days out at sea, and also a 14-year-old girl. And it's not clear if those 2 girls are actually the same child. But what's striking is that when the Clotilda arrives in Mobile, and when actually the US Marshal locates, he claims to have located 103 survivors, and Nick Tabor talks about that in his book. And that suggests that 7 of the 110 did not survive the voyage. So it seems very likely there were mortalities at sea.
You write about and this is from your book. For those who were mothers, the journey was no less traumatic. Budra's unused milk and the innocent cries of distressed children were torturous reminders that she was miles away from and powerless to return to her own three children. Gracie, who managed to hold on to her four daughters but was separated from her two sons, was forced to endure the young girl's fear and pain without being able to console them. And that's from page 49 of your book. I thought that was one of the most powerful lines in your book because it really just speaks to what those mothers would have experienced and what they would have to live with. Budra, who we talked about earlier, she would live to be, how I can't remember how you said, but around 70 in the 70s or something, or
Yeah, so actually, no, she would actually been in her 90s. So
in her 90s. Okay.
Yeah, so she lived 70 years after the voyage, and she probably would have got married around the age of 20. So on that basis, to have had three children by that point, I would have thought she'd be at least 23. So she'd be in her mid 90s.
So to be in your mid 90s and have to live with that experience, to me is just unimaginable. That knowing that you left behind children and you were powerless, and so to me, I just think that was there were three stories that stood out to me, and the Budra was one of those stories that really resonated with me. The other one was a young lady by the name of Diana Miller.
Yeah, Dinah. Yeah.
Diana Miller. And when they arrived, the 110 to the Mobile area, and they were taken off and put on the steamboat, the Czar, and went to John Dabney's plantation. Eventually, they would be sold. The final and the last survivor sold, and as she described it, she was sold for a dime, which was probably not the case, but that's what she would tell her descendants, her children. Who was Diana Miller?
So she
And what was her experience? And you know where I'm going with this, but can you talk about her experience after being sold?
Yeah, so she is about 13 years old when she's kidnapped and forced aboard the Clotilda, and apparently with her mother and brother, but she's sold away from her mother and brother and never sees them again. Now, she remembered being sold and kept at Mobile for a short time, but then she's sent to Wilcox County, where she remembered being kept in a cabin with grown men, to basically forced to have sex, and of course she quickly becomes a mother. And she describes, because her great granddaughter Olonzia Petso recorded or remembered just being forced to listen to her ancestors' stories, like the stories are practically beaten into her because her great grandmother is so determined that her life experiences not be forgotten. She's so traumatized and so angry. And Dinah lives until, again, about July 1933. So, she's also a very young woman when she dies.
How long after she's 13 when she's sold? She's forced to go and live with four men in a cabin at the plantation she was living. How many months after was it before she was with child?
So I guess her descendants' memories aren't specific enough to know, but she's 13, and of course she'll have been liberated at 18, wouldn't she? So she's a child when she becomes a mother, basically.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, that really resonated with me as well. I don't want to give too much time on this, but I think it's important that we talk about the enslavers, because these and kind of some of the high level roles that they played. Some of the names, obviously Timothy Merritt, Captain Foster, John Dabney, Washington Smith, Benjamin Rush, Alexander Giving, memorable Walker Craig, Colonel Thomas Buford, Charles Tate, William Lowndes, William Hunt, Miller. A number of these enslavers that I mentioned played permanent roles in the state of Alabama and even some in the United States. Can you talk about, and the reason I bring them up is, to me, this speaks to the systematic nature of what took place. So can you talk about at a high level and systematically the role that who these enslavers were as powerful, influential folks in Alabama and the role that they played in the final voyage of Clotilda?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with the man who enslaved Booger Moore, who was a man named Benjamin Rush Jones, Dr. Benjamin Rush Jones.
Surgeon and pharmacist.
Yes, that's right. Who appears to have been involved in this conspiracy, this crime from the beginning, because he's linked to the bet that happens that precipitates, although of course, or the wager or some kind of wager, not that precipitates the voyage, not that should obscure the wider structural forces that are leading people to basically fund a slave ship voyage on the eve of the Civil War. But Rush Jones, I think he's the brother-in-law and business partner of J. Marion Sims, the so-called father of gynecology, who develops his skills, his technique, by experimenting on enslaved women and girls, these women whose bodies have been damaged by labour. And he's doing that in an era before pain relief is widely used. So he's doing this without pain relief. He's a notorious man. There is, I believe, I think there's a monument to him in Montgomery. But he's known as the father of gynecology because his techniques were so influential. And also, actually, this is a time before gynecology really exists as a women's medicine doesn't really exist. It emerges out of slavery and the desire to profit from the bodies that damage from labor, repairing bodies so you can have more enslaved children. Basically, this is the dark history of gynecology. But Benjamin Rush Jones is also,
and AL.com I believe AL.com did a very elaborate story about what you're discussing, by the way. That's how I'm familiar. That's how I'm familiar with who he is.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's right. I would recommend checking that out. And also Benjamin Rush Jones and his friend Alexander Frederick Given, who was a children's saver, they basically involved in the sort of incorporation or of the First Presbyterian Church in Montgomery around
say
the
that,
time.
Say the name of that church again for those that are watching.
So the First Presbyterian Church in Montgomery, and they basically this establishment is all happening around the time the Clotilda bet is placed. It's about 6 months beforehand. And this man named William Lowndes Yancey is also a ruling elder at this church. And Rush Jones and Yancey also established the Alabama Bible Society around this time as well, mid-1850s. But William Lowndes Yancey is, for one thing, he's the man who welcomes Jefferson Davis to Montgomery, which when the Montgomery is named as the first capital of the Confederacy. But also he's the so-called Orator of Secession, or Prince of the Fire Eaters. And the Fire Eaters are this group of extremists who are pushing for secession from the Union as early as 1850. And a lot of them are pro-slave trade, or vocally, or they're at the very least using this slave trade argument as a way to promote secession at the very least. But it does seem to be a very serious interest in reopening the transatlantic slave trade on the eve of the Civil War. And Yancey gives this 3-day-long speech about it in 1858. But in 1860,
I can't remember. Did Yancey own any other survivors?
No, but
I didn't think so. Okay.
Yeah, not that I could find evidence for, but then I couldn't be 100% sure of who was enslaved to who. Benjamin Rush Jones, according to a 1925 newspaper article, he enslaved 12 of the Montgomery survivors. I could only determine that one of the survivors was enslaved to Alexander Given, But it's just some people had the surname Jones, which helps to points to him being their enslaver in many cases.
But Yancey was
yeah.
very instrumental in pro secessionist or what have you, and so he would give these very long, elegant speeches about at the different conventions or what have you.
Yeah, he did these Southern commercial conventions that are becoming extremely radical spaces of where Southern rights are are being vocally discussed. But he's the person who is the most vocal. But also he's the person who leads a walkout of Southern Democrats, a Democratic National Convention in 1860, just as the Clotilda is sailing across the Atlantic. And that walkout leads to the party to split in two. And when there's an election in 1860, that split in the party, the Southern Democrats versus the Democrats, means that the Republican, Abraham Lincoln, gets elected. And Abraham Lincoln's election triggers the Southern states to secede. So he's a hugely influential figure. But someone once told me, this was an academic, he said that the Civil War could be traced to one man's neuralgia. Now, Yancey didn't actually have neuralgia, but he was saying this miserable, angry man and the pain he was in triggered, so he was this historian was framing the Civil War's origins through this single man, and that was well before I wrote about the Clotilda. But yeah, so he's an extremely influential figure. Basically, he's the orator of secession. He's the man who gives voice to seceding from the Union more than anyone else. So that's a big
his relation with Benjamin Rush. What was that again? His relation with Benjamin Rush.
So so that first Presbyterian church, they're all part of that church that's established and all that's being incorporated in 1855. So I mean, Yancey dies in 1863, so he dies during the Civil War. So not too many years after that church and after the Clotilda voyage, of course. I should mention as well, so Radoshi's enslaver, Washington Smith, he's anti-secession. He actually stands for the Constitutional Union Party in the 1860 election. Basically, he has northern business interests and business interests across the Atlantic as well, in Britain and in France, but mostly in Britain. So he is less interested. So he wants to keep the Union together because he knows that his business interests are at risk. He's still pro-slavery, but that shows that not everyone who was a participant in the Clotilda crime was a secessionist. But what is striking about Smith, though, is that he then does, he's a Confederate state legislator. He funds a branch of the Confederate Army. His bank, because he's a banker, is a depository for Confederate funds, and he's the aide to the Alabama governor, the second Alabama governor basically in Montgomery. So he's still very closely connected to the Confederacy. He's just part of the original secessionist movement.
Another important topic that came from the conversation we had at the bookstore, but also I recognize this through your writing, is the overlap between the Wanderer and the Clotilda, and how a number of the Wanderer survivors would end up in Alabama. Can you talk, and to me, that also speaks to the systematic nature of all of this, right? Because we just talked about the enslavers and the role that they played. But ironically, a few months, years before Clotilda arrived, the Wanderer arrived. Can you just also talk about that overlap between the Wanderer, Clotilda, and even the enslavers?
Yeah, so the Wanderer was a slave ship that it had, I think, actually mostly all boys and young men, boys and very young men on this ship, and they were from Congolese, and there were nearly 500 of them on board the slave ship, and not many more than 300 of them survived the voyage. So this is really horrible crime. But this slave ship docks off Island, Georgia, 19 months before the Clotilda. So I think in November 1858, with its survivors, who very sadly continued to die as they're taken off the ship and moved around. But a lot of them are sold. These boys and young men are sold in Georgia, and not just Georgia, though, South Carolina, but various places. But some of them are taken and sold in Alabama. Some of them are taken through Alabama, Montgomery, in about December, around Christmas time in 1858. And they're actually, people go to, it's horrible. There's a newspaper article that suggests that people are going to see them, to look at these kind of exotic creatures, quote unquote. They're seen as like anyway, that's just really horrible and really depressing. But it shows, the sense that this crime is so visible and nobody attempts to rescue, or very few people attempt to rescue them. There is an attempt to in fact, though some of the people involved in it are brought to trial, but basically, but the Wanderer has been thought by some historians to be the last. Clotilda voyage has been denied and called a hoax, but the Wanderer has been called the last slave ship, and certainly in several history books, and until quite recently as well. But in terms of direct connections between the Wanderer and the Clotilda, now I think
one thing you mentioned, and I'm going off memory now, but for example, U.S. Senator from Georgia, Charles Tate, who was an enslaver, well known for his established plantation in Wilcox County, known to force enslaved girls and children to have sex on his plantation. If I recall, I believe it was Charles Tate. It may have been another one of the enslavers who would bring his wanderer survivor to his Wilcox plantation. Maybe I can't remember slightly. Maybe I'm getting that wrong. But there was one of the enslavers I recall who enslaved both Wanderer and Clotilda survivors. Is that resonating? Am I getting the story incorrect?
Yeah, I do have a lot of names in there. I think I might be a little bit. I think Charles Tate died earlier, but what is striking is that so the Wanderer survivors are also kind of, in many cases, lost to history, or have been for a long time, and needs to really identify who a lot of them were and where they went. But there was certainly Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was
Nathan Bedford Forrest. Okay, that's the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah, so I don't know that he had any involvement in the Clotilda voyage, but he was selling Wanderer survivors, boys, most children. And he talked about having interest in that voyage. And I think there are big questions, and I think it's something, it's establishing those direct links, but it is so striking that you have these two slave ships that happen almost at the same time. The voyages happen at the same time. And it's like they take the two routes across to the United States. So you've got one landing in Georgia on the sort of seaboard side, and then you've got one land going up the Gulf Coast. So it's as if it's opening up these two two routes, so that the slave trade can be, the US slave trade can be properly, rather than just one voyage, an actual trade of lots of ships. But it's proving that is a little bit difficult, I guess.
Let's get back, and I don't know if you have a few more minutes, but if we can just close out with the survivors and what they experienced when they learned of their freedom, both some of their fears, because some were fearful after the end of slavery. Some were even fearful that they may be sold back into slavery in Cuba. So that still haunted them. Obviously, they were, those in Mobile would form their own community. Some would reunite. To me, one of the most interesting stories that I learned was how one of the survivors would join the Union Army and fight for the Union Army once he learned of his freedom. So I think his name was Swanee or Swanee. But can you just talk about what they experienced post um, emancipation and kind of what they would do to survive?
Yeah, absolutely. So Sawney,
I know that's a
first of
very
all,
broad question. But I just wanted you to just touch on a few of them.
yeah, absolutely. So Sawney, first of all, I mean, Sawney only appears in the historical record once, as far as I can tell. There's a newspaper article that was written by his enslaver's niece in the 1890s, one of two Clotilda survivors who's sent to Pickens County, so sort of northwest, across close to the Mississippi border. For some reason, he sort of admits to her uncle's crime. And these two boys, they're described as half grown, so 10, 12, that kind of age. And the older boy, a boy named Miller, he dies very soon after they're sent there. And Sawney is obviously just trapped there by himself, horrendously, with none of his community around him. And this enslaver's niece really weirdly suggests that the enslaver kept this child in his bedroom, and obviously you don't need to say more to know what that means. But as soon as the Union Army comes to Pickens County, he joins them. He flees with them. So he follows her. As they march through the state, destroying artillery. He's part of the Union Army as it basically brings an end to the Civil War. So he plays, he's on the front line, and that's really striking. I think this Clotilda survivor is a Union Army soldier. So I think that's just great. But as I say, he disappears from history.
That's a powerful story to me. That story, like I
Yeah.
mentioned, that was one of the three that stood out. But I mean, just imagine the freedom that he may have even experienced from that moment, right? Being able to now go and fight for freedom for others. And to me, that story is so powerful within itself. We don't have time to dive into that, but I just wanted to pause on that moment because that is really significant. Do you have any other stories of, or are you aware of any other the survivors joined the Union Army at that time?
Yeah, so I couldn't see any. I know that, of course, Lottie Dennison, her American husband, joins the Union Army, and that's documented by Kenko's granddaughter, Mabel Dennison. But as for others, I know there were Wanderer survivors who joined the Union Army. It's great to read accounts about how they're the best men in the army. These accounts are by their officers saying they're the best men in the army. And there were at least three I could locate of Wanderer survivors who fought in the Union Army. I think one of the difficult things for the Clotilda survivors, because the Union Army reached where they were so late on, there was less of an, they weren't freed until 1865. They weren't, other people who might have been freed in 1862, 1863. They have to endure the whole of the war enslaved, basically. But yeah, just to touch on what happens to them afterwards. So as you mentioned, the Mobile community are very fearful that they'll be sold back into slavery. And what's striking is that these accounts by, but I think by a surgeon who records that freed people are being sold back into tricked to work on the steamboats along the Alabama and Mobile rivers. And then what's to Mobile, they're then being sold to Cuba. And what's striking is, of course, the men, his brothers Burns and James, they run the steamboats on the Alabama and Mobile River. So it just seems like a big coincidence that whoever's doing it is also involved in the steamboats. So it does seem quite likely that the mayors may still have been involved in the slave trade after the end of the Civil War. But the Mobile survivors established they tried desperately to go home. They worked so hard and save up, and of course they beg them, Timothy Mayer, and also it seems like William Foster, pay us basically to pay to go to send them home, because morally that's what they should do, of course. But of course they just say no, and the Clotilda survivors just don't have the money to be able to go home. A lot of them have children by the time the Civil War ends. So it's just impossible. What was really sad was that a missionary who could speak their language encountered them in the spring of 1869, and that's been written about before, but I think the assumption was or at least it was 1871 or whatever that he met them. It was according to newspaper sources, 1869, early 1869 that he encountered them. And he does lead this campaign to try and bring them home. But the American Colonization Society, which had been funding, which is a very controversial organization, but what had been funding recently emancipated people's voyages to Liberia. But by the time this missionary meets the Clotilda survivors, the American Colonization Society had just run out of funds. So if he'd met them 6 months or a year earlier, they may well have had that opportunity to go home. But they established their own town, Africatown today, and just this incredibly well-organized community with its own leader and judges. And they build their own houses, they build their own church, they create their own school and manage to hire a teacher. They're the most successful business people in their community as well. But it's so striking. And this community is populated by about 2,000 to 3,000 people by the early 20th century. So this is a huge achievement. It really is. And what's so sad about those who are outside, so those who are enslaved in the cotton fields of central Alabama, there's a sense actually freedom doesn't mean that freedom doesn't lead to a material change in their circumstances, because they're still bound to the land. They're still forced to work on the cotton fields. They're still desperately exploited. And Rodolphe's husband, Yaweth, he actually works out a method of counting his own cotton so he can make sure that he isn't being ripped off by the agent when he takes takes what he's collected and sells it. So you do develop all these, innovative and ingenious methods of surviving. But Rodolphe still dies, according to accounts, he still dies in the cabin in which he was enslaved. So there's a sense of that horrible continuity of slavery and post-slavery.
We're going to wrap up, but I got two final questions for you. The first one is a little selfish of me, but I have to ask about my ancestors. Who was Polly Allen and Rose Allen, and what did you learn about them too?
Yeah, so Polly Allen was already an Orisha initiate. He was probably a 19, apparently, according to sources.
What is an Orishan? For those who are not familiar.
So the Orishas are the often ancestral spirits that one worships and devotes oneself to. In the religion and the Yoruba religion that the community, the town would have. That would have been their religion. So he is someone who is already becoming this important religious figure in his community, even though he's only just about 19 years old. So that's really striking. He keeps what appears to be his name, right? He keeps that name even across the Atlantic. He manages to hold on to that initiation name that would have been the name he was given when he was, when he went through the stages to become a significant, religious figure in his community. So that's quite incredible, I think. And he still had earrings as well. He kept the earrings that he would have received as part of that.
One thing you wrote about though was how he never, I think the words that you used in 1 second was when Emma Roach Langdon visited him in his final decade of his life, police sought stoically to bury his trauma. His interviewer was not fooled. She saw that haunted look in his eyes.
Yeah, and that's what she describes in her book. He's clear. And what's also really sad is that his descendants. I mean, certainly his daughter, who was known as Mama Eva. Is that
Mama Eva?
Eva. Yeah. And she talked about how he would never talk about his experiences to his children and grandchildren. She said that she thought that he wanted to protect them from that horror, that trauma that it was just too upsetting. She also said that he could never bring himself to eat oranges, and she thought that was because they reminded him of home. So it just, those different ways in which that trauma manifests are so striking, I think, in his experience. And his wife Rosa, I mean, she dies probably in around 1891. So she doesn't appear. I think she appears twice on the census, but there's not a lot of other historical information about her. But I did wonder with that name, you know, is Rosa actually Boza? Is it
Boza.
Yeah.
Yeah, Boza. And I believe me talking with someone from Africa, that I think they said that may have been, she was born on a Tuesday, I think, is something that
Yeah, but so maybe she managed to keep her name as well. It just gets a bit corrupted. So I thought it was really striking.
Yes. So final question, and we'll wrap up. You've done a significant research on the survivors and kind of who they were and what they stood for. Actually, two final questions. What do you think their legacy is, and what role do you think descendants should be playing in regards to their legacy?
Yeah, so I think their legacy manifests itself in so many different ways, doesn't it? I mean, Africatown, this community that still survives. Okay, you've had all the horrible industrial development and the highway that goes through Africatown, but you still have this amazing community that's, you know, that needs to be protected and honoured, basically. You of course have the quilts of Gee's Bend. So Dinah Miller was an important Gee's Bend quilter. Other Clotilda survivors were living in and around Gee's Bend, and also exactly where the Freedom Quilting Bee, which is a related quilting cooperative that was established by civil rights campaigners, that also had very similar kind of unusual quilting patterns and traditions that may well have had direct influences from the Clotilda survivors and their art from West Africa. So that's, you know, the obvious visual way in which their lives survive and continue. And of course there are, I mean, smaller, you know, ways in which I think they're such an inspiration to descendants. And I think as well, one thing that's striking, and one thing I hope this book will help with, you know, when you talk about what should descendants do to honor and carry on that legacy, really. I mean, one thing is that there must be so many descendants out there, right, who don't yet know that they're descendants. And I think that's such a powerful community, if that's the case, if it's hundreds or thousands even of people. And I think it's I think it's just so important to make sure that their voices are heard and survive, and that we, you know, because they speak for so terribly. There are so few middle passage voices, right? And there are almost no women middle passage voices. So the voices of people like Radoshi, they speak for, you know, all, you know, when it's 12.5 million people, you know, they speak for those voices that were lost and that we can probably never recover. They speak for that middle passage experience, and they speak for the horrors of it, but also they speak as an inspiration. You know, they speak to show how people survived and endured in ways that were, you know, I found incredibly inspiring. I'm sure, you know, my readers will as well. So I'm not sure that gives you a clear answer about what you should now go and do, but I think it's probably what you're already doing anyway, you know, with the Clotilda Descendants Association and working to keep the legacy alive, help people join the association, and you know, getting the story out there.
Absolutely, absolutely. Dr. Durkin, thank you again for your generous time. Thank you for writing about my ancestors and their shipmates, and telling a compelling truth about what their experiences were. There was a lot in this book for those who are going to watch this interview, but we only touched the surface of what's covered in this book. And again, I highly recommend, I don't know if we can see that, but I highly recommend that you go to Amazon, wherever, and purchase the book, because there's way more details and way more covered than what we even touched the surface of. So again, Dr. Durkin, thank you again for your time. Thank you for sharing this truth with us. And I look forward to welcoming you back at another time. So thank you.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.